Start the timer! Okay, here's everything I wish I knew about compression when I started making music. Okay, what does a compressor do? A compressor brings down the loudest parts of an input and then it brings up the whole level so that the dynamic range is lessened. It's more even and consistent. Okay, first we need to know what our input level is. Our input level is whatever we're putting the compressor on. So it could be our vocal, it could be our drums, guitar, bass, whatever we're putting the compressor on, the level of that instrument is what our input level will be. Okay, now let's move over to our compressor and let's look at the different controls on a compressor and understand what they do. Okay, first here we have a threshold. Threshold here on the left is the first thing we need to understand. So here we have the threshold at minus 20 decibels, minus 20 dB. If the input level is below minus 20, no compression happens. Only the level that goes above that threshold will get compressed. The next parameter we need to look at is ratio. We have 2:1 here at the minute. So what does 2:1 mean in a ratio? 2:1 ratio would mean for every 2 decibels, our input level goes over the threshold, 1 decibel will be let through. So let's look at some examples of this ratio. So if we had a threshold of minus 20 and we had a ratio of 2:1, if our input level is minus 18, 2 decibels over the threshold, 1 decibel will be let through over the threshold. So the output will be minus 19. Now let's move our ratio to 5:1. Now let's imagine our input level was minus 10 dB and our threshold is still minus 20. So that's 10 decibels over the threshold and we're at the ratio of 5:1. So 5 goes into 10 twice, so 2 decibels over the threshold will be allowed through to the output. So our overall output will be minus 18 decibels. Great, now let's move on to the next two, attack and release. So our attack here basically tells us how long in milliseconds will it take for the compressor to finish its action of gain reduction after the input level goes over the threshold. So let's see here, we're on 5.5 milliseconds. So once our input level goes over minus 20 decibels, it will take the compressor 5.5 milliseconds for it to finish its full gain reduction. And the release here, release basically means how long does it take for the compressor to stop working after the input level goes back below the threshold. So in this case here, 54 milliseconds, once the input level goes back below the threshold of minus 20, it will take the compressor 54 milliseconds for the compressor to stop working totally and having zero effect on the input signal. Okay, so here's some examples of how we can use all this information. If we want our instrument, our voice, bass, guitar, drum hit to sound very produced and very controlled and not have a huge dynamic range, we can have a high ratio and we can have the threshold relatively low. It's going to compress it a lot more. But say we have a slow romantic song and you want it to be really authentic and genuine, more of a dynamic range, we'll have a ratio lower down, maybe to something around 2 or 1.5, something like that. And we'll have the threshold not so high. And that will allow the input, guitars, vocals, whatever it is, to just have a bit more of a dynamic range and feel a bit more emotional. So it depends on what the song calls for. Now when we look at attack and release, we can get really creative with these. I really love having a long attack for drum hits or guitar strums or bass plucks or anything like that, because the compressor doesn't act for a while, so it allows the percussiveness of those hits to really get through. So there's still a hit and it's quite strong, and then the compressor starts the gain reduction. And then on the opposite side of that, for the release, we can bring the release down so that the tail or the decay of any instrument or sound or breath or whatever it is at the end of our sound, we can really hear that because the volume comes straight back up. It doesn't get gain reduced. If you're doing pop vocals or rap vocals that you want to hear everything and be really clear and sound very professional, I would suggest having a relatively low, as low as possible, sometimes down to 1 attack and maybe 5 release, something like that, because then the level doesn't change too much and we can hear every single part of the vocal and it will just make it sound really clean, tidy, and has a sheen on it. So that's something you can do for, say, rap and pop vocals. Nearly out of time, last thing. With compression, you're better off doing less than more. If you're not totally sure what you're doing, just do a tiny bit and then see how it works. Beware of doing too much, because then you can have it sounding a bit squashed and then the compressor's doing too much and our vocal or whatever the input is will sound like it can't breathe, and that's not really a sound that we'd ever want. Okay, hopefully this helps. Let me know down in the comments if there's anything else you'd like to know, or catch me over on Twitch on Mondays, Wednesdays and Saturdays, and I could do another full run through with you there if you wanted. And if you could hit the like, subscribe and bell notification button, that would be sweet as well. Cool, sweet. Okay, great. Hopefully this helps. Best of luck with the music making. Cheers. Woo! Just on time.